I've learned over the years that nothing interesting ever happens before breakfast. And in my case, the morning ritual consists of two things: a stout cup of black coffee and the quiet contemplation of whatever culinary masterpiece Fritz has devised for Wolfe's first course. This particular dawn, however, came with an extra measure of disquiet. I was just settling in with my cup when the front door chimed. Unmistakable, a single measured ring that meant business, not a social call, exactly the sort of interruption Nero Wolfe detested. I followed the tone to the entrance hall, where Theodore Horowitz was already rifling through the post. On the small black bureau lay the usual assortment of bills, telegrams, and advertisements, none of which warranted Wolfe's attention, but tucked beneath everything else was an envelope of heavy parchment, sealed with deep green wax stamped in an unfamiliar crest. I recognized the handwriting immediately, a precise looping copperplate that spelled out Mr. Nero Wolfe and nothing else. No return address, no postmark, just a summons. I carried it with the utmost care into Wolfe's den. He was reclining in his familiar orchid-scented repose, his eyes closed as if he were merely napping. I cleared my throat, a formality that ordinarily summoned a sharp, "What is it, Archie?" But today only silence followed. I placed the envelope on the small table beside his chair and retreated to my desk, curious to see if he'd break his routine. Minutes ticked by. Wolfe's eyelids fluttered at the sound of my pen scratching on a pad, but he said nothing. Finally, he reached out with a single, deliberate finger and tapped the seal. The green wax cracked. Out came a folded sheet, printed in ink, the color of spattered broth. It read, "Esteemed Mr. Wolfe, I request your presence at 6 Convent Place this evening. Failure to arrive by 8:30 will render moot the circumstances I wish to discuss. This matter pertains to the integrity of a certain alibi, an alibi that once compromised may implicate more than one innocent party. I trust your discretion. Faithfully yours, a concerned benefactor." Wolfe's gaze lifted from the page to mine, keen and cold as polished obsidian. He said nothing for a long moment, and I could almost hear the gears of his mind ticking. Then, in his most measured tone, one reserved for cases that intrigued him beyond the mere promise of a fee, he murmured, "Have Horowitz arrange my schedule. I shall dine lightly tonight," I dared a quip. "Lightly? You haven't eaten broth this thin since the Jackson case." He ignored me, folding the letter and slipping it into his breast pocket. "Notify Saul Panzer," he ordered. "And you?" "Goodwin, assemble anything you know of alibis shattered by means of deliberate misdirection." I nodded and filed out. The brownstone felt different now, its familiar hush crowded by the anticipation of something sly and dangerous. A silent threat had crept inside, dressed in polite prose and green wax. What it wanted and why this benefactor had chosen Wolfe remained to be seen. But I knew one thing: once Nero Wolfe decided a matter was worth his attention, there was no turning back. Dinner could wait. Tonight, we would peel back an alibi like one of Fritz's artichokes, layer by layer, until we reached the bitter heart beneath. That afternoon, the brownstone's usual hum of calm was shattered. From my vantage at the desk, I saw Saul Panzer's angular figure materialize in the front hall, carrying a briefcase and an expression more alert than any courier ought to display. Wolfe remained perched in his chair, eyes closed, as Horowitz hovered nearby with a notepad. I rose to greet Saul, who handed me a single photograph before slipping quietly into the den. The image depicted a cluttered kitchen shelf, a row of broth jars, one conspicuously empty, lid askew. Below it, scrawled in what looked like broth-stained ink, was the word liar. Wolfe opened one eye. He inclined his head, and Saul's fingers dug into the pocket of his coat. Out came a small vial of clear liquid. "Found outside 6 Convent Place," Saul reported. "Traces of the same stock used in your broth, sir. Someone wanted you to know we'd been there." Wolfe took the vial without moving from his seat, studied it, then nodded once. Horowitz scribbled furiously. "The benefactor doesn't waste words," Wolfe murmured. We proceeded through the brownstone's corridors toward the kitchen. Every footstep echoed off marble floors that usually bore the reassuring tap of Fritz's footsteps. Instead, we found the kitchen door ajar, its latch wrenched free. Inside, the spice rack lay overturned, cinnamon jars and dried peppers scattered across the tile. A thin film of broth coated the floor, leading toward the pantry. Wolfe's nostrils flared at this deliberate mess. He motioned to Saul. "Trace that trail." While Saul and Horowitz inspected the scene, I examined the pantry. The shelf where Fritz stored his prized chicken consommé was missing a single pot labeled No. 3. That was the signature blend Wolfe savored most. Its absence felt personal, almost insolent. Wolfe stood and paced the threshold, hands clasped behind his back. "They know exactly what they're doing," he observed. "This isn't random. Whoever seeks to shatter an alibi intends to break something more precious. Archie Goodwin, adjust your tie and gather your wits. You'll need, both when suspects arrive to be questioned, and later, when you decipher why Broth and alibis share the same brittle fragility. Now generate Section 3 of the story, ensuring smooth continuity from the previous section. Maintain the same pacing, character development, and mystery build-up without premature reveals. Keep the word count consistent, progressing the narrative, naturally while leading into the next section. By the time the grandfather clock in the front room chimed 6, the brownstone was no longer a refuge, but a stage. Wolfe had left the broth incident for Saul to analyze, and turned his attention to the list the so-called concerned benefactor had enclosed in a second message delivered by hand. No envelope this time, just a typed sheet wedged under the front door like a threat in polite disguise. 4 names neatly aligned: Cora Bentley, Harold L. Mincer, Lila Rourke, and brother Thomas Vallon. No explanation, no context. Wolfe read them in silence, twice. Then he handed the page to me and said, "We received them here one by one, schedule them starting tomorrow." That gave me the night to dig. And since Wolfe didn't share, I did what any good legman would do. I called Lon Cohen at the Gazette and hinted that I was chasing a story that touched on alibis, broth, and maybe, just maybe, some religious scandal. That last bit was bait, and Lon swallowed it whole. By morning, I had dossiers on all 4. Cora Bentley, age 47, was the widow of a food processing magnate and current board chair of Bentley Kitchens, Inc., a corporation known for its pre-packaged soups and frozen broth cubes. That piqued Wolfe immediately. "The vulgarization of flavor," he muttered when I mentioned it. Cora lived on Park Avenue in an apartment where the kitchen had been converted into a wine gallery. She was described by the society pages as refined, authoritative, and unusually obsessed with recipe copyrights. Next was Harold L. Mincer, a name that should have belonged to a butcher, but in this case belonged to a corporate auditor. He'd worked for Bentley Kitchens until 3 months ago, when he resigned over what the company had called strategic incompatibility. Translation: he found something. They wanted him gone. He now consulted for a line of organic broth startups, a business that put him at odds with his former employer. Motive? Sure, but too neat. Lila Rourke, age 32, worked as an independent food chemist, one of the brains behind the signature taste profiles used in modern mass-market soups. She'd been under contract with both Bentley Kitchens and a lesser-known firm called Quanta Flavors. What made her stand out wasn't her resume, but the little side note from Lon. She was once engaged to Mincer. I flagged that in red. Finally, brother Thomas Vallon, age 55, was listed as Director of Culinary Outreach at a monastery upstate. The title sounded like PR dressing on a monk with a soup ladle. I called the monastery. They confirmed Vallon's role in their communal kitchen, but I picked up hesitation when I asked about Bentley. "We used to receive donations," the man said. That arrangement ended abruptly. He wouldn't elaborate. 4 suspects, 4 paths, each tied, somehow, to broth and betrayal. Wolfe had them scheduled starting noon, 15-minute intervals. He didn't say what he expected. That was my job, and I was ready. Cora Bentley arrived exactly on time, wearing a hat so wide I had to adjust the chair to keep her feathers from brushing the orchid stand. She didn't sit. She inspected the room as if pricing it. Wolfe greeted her with a barely audible grunt. "I understand you are to question me," she said. "About what exactly?" Wolfe didn't look up. "Your association with Bentley Kitchens. A concern has been raised regarding the integrity of an alibi tied to a recent misdirection. It may involve intellectual theft. Intellectual theft? Her voice had the icy ring of champagne flutes clinking. That sounds like something Harold would say. Indeed, Wolfe replied. Did Mr. Mincer ever dispute your methods? She hesitated. Harold is principled, but dramatic. He thought, I was too aggressive with our chemists. He wanted more testing, I wanted results, and frankly, if Lila Rourke hadn't been so quick to side with him, Wolfe's eyes flicked upward. Ms. Rourke took sides. So of course she did. She always does. She's terribly emotional, which I suppose is charming in a dinner guest, but less so in an R&D lab. Cora left behind a faint cloud of expensive perfume and a hint of controlled panic. She hadn't asked why Wolfe was involved. She didn't need to. That alone said plenty. Harold Mincer followed with a kind of disgruntled energy that made him walk faster than necessary and sit too stiffly. He was the kind of man who'd correct your grammar even while confessing. I assume this is about Cora's little problem, he said. She's got her hands in a lot of pots, but her secrets don't simmer forever. Wolfe twitched a brow. You are familiar with a certain broth marked number 3? Mincer looked startled just for a second. That was Fritz's signature, wasn't it? She tried to copy it. When that didn't work, she tried to buy it. That was news. I filed it away. She offered Fritz money, I asked. She offered, How many money? Mincer said dryly. To get the lab profile from Quanta, I refused, and yes, I still have the voicemail. You want ethics? Record everything. Mincer didn't smile when he said it. He was the kind of man who used proof like armor. He left the office muttering about people who thought a monk and a flavor chemist wouldn't talk. Lila Rourke. Arrive a third. She looked tired, wore no makeup, and clutched a scarf like it might protect her from questions. She didn't sit. She hovered. I didn't steal anything, she said unprompted. If this is about number 3, I never cracked the profile. I tried. Everyone tried. Wolfe folded his hands. What prevented you? She blinked. The finish, the aftertaste. It changed depending on the taster. That's what made it genius. It wasn't consistent, it was too personal. That caught Wolfe's attention. He tilted his head. You speak with reverence. She looked down. It's the only food I've ever tasted that reminded me of my mother. No one said anything. Wolfe finally dismissed her with a nod, and she practically fled. The last was Brother Thomas Vallon. He wore a simple black robe and carried a tin of herbs. He presented it to Wolfe like an offering. I have no broth to defend, he said gently, but I have kept the recipe. What recipe? Wolfe asked. The one my order used before Bentley Kitchens stopped donating. They said their formula was proprietary now, that we were misusing it. Were you? We added rosemary, Vallon said with a sad smile. Hardly a crime, but someone accused us of selling it. We never did. That betrayal hurt. I asked. Who accused you? He looked at me evenly. A woman named Cora. She called our monastery's number herself, told us we'd breached contract. We didn't even know we had one. When Vallon left, the brownstone exhaled again. Wolfe stayed silent. I jotted a few lines, then looked up. Well? Wolfe didn't move. Not yet. Not yet meant he'd seen something, but not everything. The pieces were there, but the alignment was wrong. Someone was telling the truth badly, or lying too well, and I had a hunch that broth wasn't the only thing being cooked. By the next morning, Wolfe's orchids had received more of his attention than I had. He didn't speak a word over breakfast, except to mutter something about intellectual offenses being more pungent than garlic. That was my cue. I topped off my coffee, packed my notebook, and slipped out into the city to sniff around the corners Wolfe wouldn't dirty his shoes on. We had 4 suspects, each with something to lose, but Wolfe wasn't just looking for motive, he wanted contradictions. And contradictions, I've learned, don't usually live in the office. They live in kitchens, side streets, and more often than not, in what people don't say when they think no one's watching. I started with Bentley Kitchens, which occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown. The receptionist looked like she could recite stock prices in her sleep, and judging by the glare she gave my ID badge, she didn't welcome unscheduled visits. But when I dropped Cora Bentley's name and hinted that I might be writing something, the doors opened faster than you could boil water. I was shown into a waiting room with chairs that looked like modern art torture devices and walls lined with mock-ups of soup cartons, everything from creamy winter squash to organic umami explosion. No sign of Fritz's beloved broth, but plenty of slogans about flavor innovation. A junior PR associate named Miles came in, all skinny tie and nervous energy. I gave him my best Goodwin smile, pleasant but sharp, and started lobbing softballs. "How's Cora to work with?" He shifted. "She's intense, demanding, but smart, always pushing." "Ever push someone too far?" He hesitated, then nodded. "There was a guy in accounting, Mincer. He left abruptly, said he couldn't condone some kind of recipe acquisition. But that stuff happens in food R&D all the time. You reverse engineer a taste, tweak a molecule. Nobody talks about it, but everyone does it." I let that sink in, then asked about Lila Rourke. She freelanced for us. Never full-time. I think she took the Mincer fallout personally. They used to, well, you know, that I did. I left with a few internal memos Miles accidentally printed for me, including one from Cora labeled Confidential, Acquisition, of Proprietary Stock Profile. So much for subtlety. Next, I tracked down Lila at her lab near the East River. The place smelled like vinegar and burnt herbs, and the receptionist was a cat. I waited 5 minutes before Lila emerged, still wearing goggles and gloves. Her hair was pinned up in a way that suggested she'd done it 6 hours ago and hadn't thought about it since. "I said everything I needed to in your office," she told me. I nodded. "Sure, but I'm not here to ask questions. I'm here to watch what you're working on." That caught her. Scientists, especially the obsessed kind, don't walk away from a chance to showcase obsession. She led me to a bench crowded with flasks and labeled vials. In one, something murky brown simmered over a tiny flame. "This is my own," she said. "No reverse engineering, no stolen notes, just instinct." "What's the goal?" She paused. "To make broth that tastes like memory." I blinked. "That's either genius or the worst tagline in history," she smiled. "That's the problem. Cora doesn't want taste, she wants control. When she couldn't get number 3's profile, she tried to have me make something close enough for legal." "Claim, did you?" "I tried, it failed. But she filed paperwork anyway. Trademark aggression, accused me of theft. And Mincer. We stopped speaking after he left Bentley. He said I was too compromised. I thanked her and left. But the phrase tastes like memory stayed with me. It sounded like something Wolfe would either scoff at or quote while slathering toast with pâté. I swung by Brother Thomas's monastery. Next, the place was peaceful, clean, and suspiciously silent. I was greeted by a man in a grey robe who looked like he moonlighted as a bouncer. He told me brother. Thomas wasn't available, but after some gentle pressure he admitted there had been a lot of tension since the Bentley fallout. Some of the younger brothers thought we should sell the recipe, he said. We didn't. But we talked about that was enough to get us cut off. Miss Bentley made it very clear we were no longer suitable partners. Anyone push back? Brother Thomas wrote a letter. She never replied. After that, someone broke into our storage and took a batch. Wait, someone stole your broth. Yes, a batch marked rosemary trial, monastery use only. Gone, just like that. Did you report it? No, we thought it might be divine consequence. I didn't have Wolfe's aversion to fresh air, but I was starting to see the appeal of the brownstone's silence. Everyone in this mess had been burned by Cora Bentley. Some wanted revenge, some just wanted distance. But someone with knowledge and nerve, was manipulating more than soup. I saved Harold Mincer for last. He was staying at a midtown hotel, consulting for a boutique broth startup called Genuine. I dropped in on his lunch meeting at the hotel's cafe. He was eating lentil soup, which struck me as either ironic or tragic. "You again," he muttered. "Did Wolfe send you for a spoon sample?" "Nope, just confirming something." He dabbed his mouth with a napkin. "Which is? Were you the one who sent the green wax letter?" He froze, not dramatically, just enough to let me know the dart had landed. Then he chuckled. "No, I wish I had. That letter was art. A perfect blend of guilt, urgency, and mystery. Not my style." "Then whose?" "My guess? Someone from Quanta. Maybe Lila trying to push Wolfe into this. Or Cora herself playing two sides." That theory didn't hold. Cora didn't seem like the type to share attention, but before I could. Press further, Mincer pulled a small envelope from his jacket. I was waiting to see how long it would take you to show up. Inside was a lab result, something dated from 3 weeks ago. A broth sample marked Q-Proj43 with a handwritten note, finish matches number 3 within 3% variance. Source unknown. Where'd this come from? It was slid under my door. Someone made it. The taste was nearly perfect. Did you test it? Of course. And then I destroyed it. That was the most surprising thing he'd said all day. Why? Because if that broth is floating around without provenance, then we're past sabotage. We're in forgery territory. That's the kind of thing that ruins careers, and not just Cora's. I thanked him and headed out. Wolfe would want every detail, every hesitation, every soup spoon of ambiguity. And he'd probably want Fritz to check the sample's taste too, just to prove whether 3% was close enough to pass. Back at the brownstone, I reported everything. Wolfe listened, unmoving, eyes closed. When I finished, he asked one question. Did anyone mention what was missing from the original number 3? I blinked. No. Why? He opened his eyes. Because what isn't there often matters more than what is. That was Wolfe, all right. While I was chasing ingredients, he was thinking in negatives. I had a feeling the broth that broke the alibi wasn't important for what it tasted like, but for what it excluded, and whoever had that knowledge was about to get more uncomfortable. Wolfe didn't ring the bell. He didn't summon the suspects, but his silence told me everything. We were getting close. The broth wasn't the story. It was the bait, and the trap was about to close. The brownstone, by mid-afternoon, had returned to its usual state of monastic order. Polished surfaces, unread newspapers precisely folded, and Fritz somewhere in the kitchen preparing something. That would either calm Wolfe's nerves or sharpen his senses, depending on the mood. But something had shifted beneath that calm. Wolfe hadn't spoken since I gave my report. He remained anchored in his chair, not in his usual post-lunch stupor, but something more calculating, his brow furrowed deeper than usual, one foot slightly tapping. That meant the wheels were turning. Around 4, Fritz appeared in the doorway, with a small bowl steaming and aromatic. He didn't say anything, just set it on the side table and left. Wolfe glanced at it, sniffed, and then leaned forward with a mild grunt of discomfort. "It's not right," he murmured. I looked up from my notes. "What's wrong?" "Too thin," he said. "Too much fennel, and the aftertaste is sharp. Maybe Fritz is experimenting." "No," Wolfe said, flat. "Fritz does not experiment during crises. He prepares." I stood and walked to the kitchen. Fritz was at the stove, stirring a pan with deliberate rhythm. When I asked if something was off with the broth, he looked insulted. I prepared no. 3 as usual, he said. "I even used a reserve jar from the cellar. If anything tastes different, then something has been altered." That did it. I returned to Wolfe. "He says he used a reserve jar." Wolfe's nostrils flared. "Then I shall taste the jar myself." Now, if you know Wolfe, you know that getting out of his chair voluntarily, without an emergency or the threat of litigation, is comparable to an eclipse. But he rose slowly and stiffly, like a mountain realigning. I followed him to the cellar, where Fritz kept a small rack of sealed jars reserved for Wolfe's personal consumption. They were labeled meticulously. Num 3, date, time, source, batch, notes. There were 6 remaining. Wolfe selected one from the middle, checked the seal, then cracked it open and dipped a silver spoon he'd brought from upstairs. He closed his eyes and tasted. When he opened them again, they were cold. "This is not mine," he said. I frowned. "It's not Fritz's. It is not the original blend. Someone tampered with the reserves. Now we were in dangerous territory. The brownstone is Wolfe's sanctum." The idea that someone had accessed the cellar without a key, without Fritz noticing, wasn't just alarming. It was insulting. And Wolfe does not take insults lightly. He handed me the jar. "Take it to Saul. Have him run it through a lab? No. Have him trace the lid, any prints, any traces of recent handling. Then check the other 5 jars." Back upstairs, Wolfe sank into his chair again, more rigid this time. He didn't fume, he didn't shout, but I could feel the temperature drop. Someone had broken in. Not to steal anything of value, but to replace something. That's subtler. That's riskier. That's personal. By evening, Fritz reported a second oddity. The spice rack had been reorganized, slightly. One of the dried bay leaves was missing. A new jar of clove had been opened. And a measuring spoon. Wolfe's preferred quarter teaspoon wasn't where he'd left it. Do you think they were just trying to fake the number 3 profile? I asked. Wolfe shook his head. No. They were embedding something. A message. Hidden within mimicry. I jotted that down. Like what? Deceit, he said. He executed under the guise of homage. I paused. That sounds poetic. For you. He glared at me. This is no longer merely a theft of flavor, Archie. It is a trespass against integrity. Someone seeks not to copy, but to replace, to suggest that the original was never special, never unique. He closed his eyes. That is unforgivable. Saul called at 7:40. He had news. The tampered jar showed recent handling, glove prints only, latex. The clove showed minute residue inconsistent with Fritz's usual stock, and one of the other 5 jars, gone, replaced with a decoy made of tinted gelatin and stock powder, like something you'd use on a food set for a commercial. So someone broke in, I said, swapped a real jar with a fake, then doctored the one Fritz used so it would seem off, but not too off. Enough for you to notice, but not enough to alert anyone else. Wolfe nodded once. That is correct. Why? To cast doubt. In me. In Fritz. In the record. To suggest that the original number 3 was always replicable, that it was never proprietary. That it was public domain dressed up in ego. That narrowed it. Only one person in our pool had something to gain from discrediting number 3's originality, Cora Bentley. Her company couldn't recreate it, couldn't buy it, and now someone had replaced the authentic sample to pave the way for legal claim. But Wolfe didn't move. He didn't issue an invitation to confront her. Instead, he asked a single question. Where is Brother Thomas? I blinked. Upstate? No, Wolfe said. He is in New York. I checked the calendar. Brother Thomas had not been scheduled to return. No visits were planned, no deliveries arranged. Someone saw him. I did, Wolfe said. Through the window. 2 hours. Tego, he passed the sidewalk, glanced at our stoop and walked on. That was chilling. Why wouldn't he come in? Because he's afraid, Wolfe replied. And afraid men watch from a distance. I checked the guest log. No name. But Fritz mentioned a figure hovering outside around 3 p.m. Tall, dark robe, didn't knock. Brother Thomas had known something, maybe the original recipe, maybe the flaw in the imposter version. Either way, he was circling us. I stepped out for a smoke and checked the street. Sure enough, a figure stood half a block down across from a bookstore. When I approached, he turned, but not fast enough. Brother Thomas, I said. He stopped. Didn't deny it. You've got something to say. Say it inside. He hesitated, then nodded. One condition. Name it. You let me speak to Mr. Wolfe. Alone. That wasn't happening, but I let him believe it might. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe watched him enter with a gaze like ice on glass. Thomas bowed slightly. You know I didn't take anything, he said. I know, Wolfe replied. But you saw someone who did. Thomas nodded. 2 weeks ago, a woman. She visited the monastery in the evening, asked about our storage, said she wanted to recreate the sacred broth. I thought she meant spiritually. Then I found the storage door ajar the next day. Name, Wolfe said. Thomas hesitated. She called herself Ms. Renault, but she had an accent, and she knew too much about the original number 3. Describe her. Short, pale, freckled, brown eyes, soft voice. That wasn't Cora. That wasn't Lila. That wasn't anyone we knew, until Wolfe spoke. Archie, fetch the folder from Quanta Flavors. The dismissed intern, the one listed under alias for NDA violation. I did. And when I opened the file, there she was, Eva Renault. Dismissed 2 months ago for unauthorized sample testing. She'd never been on the suspect list. But she'd been watching. Wolfe closed his eyes. The game has changed. New suspect? No, the same suspect with a proxy. He turned to Brother Thomas. Thank you. You've preserved something sacred, not the broth, but its truth. And just like that, we had a new name. And maybe, just maybe, the missing piece. You know things. Are getting serious when Nero Wolfe doesn't touch his beer at lunch. Not a sip. He let it sit there, perspiring beside his buttered cornmeal muffins, completely ignored while he sat motionless, his lips pressed together like he'd bitten into something foul and didn't want to show it. That's how I knew we were at what he'd call a critical bend. For the rest of us, it was simply, we're neck deep and someone's tightening the screws. By late morning, Brother Thomas had been quietly escorted out the back by Saul Panzer, who would keep him on ice somewhere. Wolfe approved and windowless. Eva Renault, alias Ms. Renault, our mystery monastery intruder, was now square in Wolfe's crosshairs, and though she hadn't set foot in the brownstone, Wolfe had begun to plan as if she already had. That's the thing about him. He doesn't need someone in the room to interrogate them. He just needs the facts to swirl tightly enough. I spent the better part of the afternoon on the phone, working my way through HR records, old NDA violations, and a string of barely legible email logs from Quanta Flavor's IT guy, who probably hadn't slept since Y2K. What I got was more than enough to stir the pot. Eva Renault had been a food science intern, brilliant palate, behavioral issues. Terminated 2 months ago after she tried replicating the number 3 profile from stolen sample dust. When confronted, she claimed she wasn't stealing, just liberating a suppressed formula. Quanta buried the incident to avoid lawsuits, but it was clear. Eva believed number 3 was a fraud, and she was determined to prove it. I brought the findings to Wolfe, who sat, as always, surrounded by silence and orchids. He glanced through the documents and muttered, "Zealotry disguised as rectitude. She seeks not to copy number 3, but to dismantle its uniqueness. And someone's helping her," I added. "Someone with access to the brownstone, or at least to someone who has." Wolfe looked at me with that dark, narrowed gaze that meant he'd already reached the conclusion and was now waiting for the rest of us to catch up. "Renault is not the principal architect," he said. "You think she's being used?" "She is the artisan. The true saboteur has motive, reach, and a name that commands silence." "Cora," I said. He nodded once. "Then why not confront her?" "Not yet. First, we isolate the middleman. The breach inside our walls was not executed by Renault. It was facilitated. We must identify who allowed it." So I got back on the horn with Saul, who had already checked the brownstone's entry. Logs. Nothing unusual. Horowitz hadn't noticed any new deliveries, no missing keys, and the alarm system hadn't tripped. But Fritz remembered something. "A delivery," he told me that evening, his voice low and troubled. 2 weeks ago. A package labeled as spices. I didn't order anything, but the label had my name. I assumed Mr. Wolfe had arranged something. "What did you do with it?" "I placed it on the counter. When I returned from my break, it was gone. Gone, just like that. In Fritz's kitchen, his fortress of order." Wolfe's face when I relayed this didn't twitch, but I could tell. Internally, he'd already marked the moment as decisive. So, someone had used a fake delivery to get something into the house. Maybe the fake broth, maybe the doctored jar, possibly even the clove, but how had it disappeared? "Who was here that day?" Wolfe asked. We pulled the visitor log. The only visitor during that time was Lila Rourke. She'd come in for a brief consultation, stayed under 10 minutes and left. Harmless on the surface until you paired that with her lab history and access to flavor profiles. She could have easily carried out the swap while Fritz was in the conservatory or distracted. She knew the kitchen's layout from her earlier days assisting Wolfe during a brief freelance consulting stint years ago. "Lila's the conduit," Wolfe said. "She facilitated access. Whether she knew the full plan is irrelevant. She enabled violation." That's when Wolfe rang the bell. Not for Fritz, for Saul. And that meant something was moving. "Have her watched," Wolfe instructed. "Day and night. Track every contact, every call. We press now." And just as the gears began to grind in that direction, something else dropped, literally. At 6:30 sharp, a thin man in a grey suit, unfamiliar, early 30s, wire-rimmed glasses, walked up the stoop and dropped a small parcel through the mail. Slot. By the time I opened the door, he was halfway down the block. The box was unmarked, wrapped in butcher paper, and tied with kitchen twine. I handed it to Wolfe. He didn't touch it directly. He motioned to me. "Gloves," he said. I retrieved them, opened the box, and there it was. A jar of broth. Identical to Fritz's number 3, but with one addition, a tiny paper tag attached to the lid with the words, "Can you taste the difference?" That did it. Wolfe sniffed but did not taste. He passed it to me with clear disgust, and I called Saul again. Within the hour, he had the jar sealed and on its way to a private lab, one Wolfe trusted more than any government agency. While we waited, Wolfe's silence thickened. He refused dinner, refused beer, and refused to speak for 45 minutes straight. Then abruptly he spoke. "She's escalating. This jar is not evidence, it's bait." Meant to prove the recipes. Replicable. No, meant to rattle me, to force action. They want a public response, a legal misstep, a statement, a slip. Who's they? Wolfe turned his head slightly. Cora, Eva, and now Lila, whose loyalty is divided between ego and debt. But you won't summon them. I will, but not until I am the one controlling the misdirection. That was Wolfe's version of a declaration of war. It was time to pull the net. Saul's report came back that night. The broth was a near-perfect chemical match, 98.7% variance. But the key difference? A trace compound not present in Fritz's blend. A stabilizer used in commercial shelf broth, a rookie mistake. Eva tried to scale it, Wolfe said, which means she's planning to submit it for legal challenge, maybe patent review. But she couldn't mask the preservative. And that was our tell. A fingerprint in soup form. Wolfe rose and dictated a single letter. It was short, sharp, and addressed to Cora Bentley. It read, "Your artisan made one error too many. You have 72 hours to withdraw your claim, or I shall dismantle it publicly, molecule by molecule." He signed it in ink, sealed it in green wax, his color. Now, and handed it to me. "Deliver it," he said, "personally." I took it, slid into my coat, and as I opened the front door, I saw Fritz standing by the stairs, arms folded. "She tried to erase us," he said softly. "No," I told him. "She only succeeded in waking him up." And with that, I stepped into the night. The pressure was rising, but Wolfe was just getting warm. By the time I returned from hand-delivering Wolfe's letter to Cora Bentley's gleaming fortress on Park Avenue, a building with more surveillance than sense of hospitality, Wolfe had already begun his counter-offensive. I walked into the brownstone to find him not reading, not brooding, not sulking in his chair with a glass of beer or a snide remark, but dictating a list of instructions to Saul Panzer over the phone with the kind of cold, precise rhythm you associate with surgeons or very experienced chess players. He didn't look up when I dropped my coat. "She took it. She read it," I said. Didn't say a word. Had one of her assistants opened the door, and she was waiting inside, standing like a marble bust in her silk robe. I handed it to her. She opened it with a letter opener shaped. Like a spoon, read it once and then said, "Tell him the timer has started." That was it. Wolfe grunted, which in Wolf speak meant she's playing, but she's nervous. He went back to his phone call, muttered a few more names, Lila, Eva, Brother Thomas, and hung up with a decisive tap. "She's waiting for us to flinch," he told me, "which is why we will do the opposite. We will proceed as though the outcome is settled and inevitable. In our favor? Of course," he leaned back and steepled his fingers. "Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, assemble the suspects." "All of them?" "All of them. Cora, Lila, Harold Mintzer, Brother Thomas, yes, invite him again, and Eva Renault. Saul will retrieve her. You think she'll come? She's not being given a choice." He closed his eyes and folded his hands. That meant the stage was set, but if Wolfe was building the climax, it was on shifting sand. We still didn't know how the breach occurred, who let Eva slip in, and whether this whole show was an attempt to kill number 3's legacy or hijack it. What we did know was that someone had tried to discredit Wolfe through his food, his chef, and his pride. And Wolfe was treating it like a siege. That evening, he had Fritz lay out the original recipe for number 3 on the kitchen table, not to cook, but to display. It was handwritten in Wolfe's blocky script, with annotations by Fritz. Alongside it, Wolfe placed a second document, the lab analysis from Saul. The one that showed Eva's broth was chemically similar, but corrupted with a synthetic stabilizer. Archie, Wolfe said as I passed through the kitchen, summarize that analysis for laymen. You'll read it tomorrow. Read it where? In the office, he said. Before witnesses. That was classic Wolfe. Turn the evidence into a performance, but he wasn't done. Also, he added, prepare a photograph of our cellars. Broth shelf, before and after the tampering. You think that'll spook them? No, he said. It will shame them. I spent the rest of the night organizing documents, printing timelines, and rechecking the visitor log for any missed names. At 10 p.m., Fritz brought Wolfe a silent plate of roast duck and braised fennel, his version of an apology. Wolfe ate quietly, then, without looking up, said, You are absolved, Fritz. You did not fail me. It was the closest thing to affection I'd ever heard him offer. The next morning the invitations went out, formal notes typed and signed sent by courier. You are requested to attend a consultation at the home of Mr. Nero Wolfe regarding matters of professional and ethical concern. That was the header. No hint of accusations, just vague enough to force curiosity and compliance. Wolfe didn't ask me to prepare his office. He just expected it. So I rearranged the chairs, 4 for the suspects in a semicircle, 1 empty chair off to the side for Brother Thomas, and Wolfe's throne-like seat behind the desk. My own chair, always slightly out of the line of fire, stood near the door. At noon, Saul arrived with Eva Renault. She didn't look like someone who'd just been cornered by a licensed investigator and dragged into a brownstone. She looked curious. That unnerved me. She was short, slim, hair pinned back, eyes sharp, and her expression hovered somewhere between smug and serene. She didn't resist, Saul said. In fact, she asked what took us so long. That made Wolfe snort. He didn't look up from his reading. Put her in the guest room, he said. She may remain under observation until this evening. Saul nodded. She didn't protest. 6:30 p.m. everyone had arrived. Cora Bentley was first, dressed like a visiting head of state. Behind her, Lila Rourke, visibly anxious, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped mouse. Harold Mincer entered next, stiff and rehearsed. Brother Thomas came last, escorted by Saul, his expression composed but pale. Wolfe waited for silence. When everyone was seated, he opened his eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, I have summoned you because someone among you has trespassed against truth. Not law, necessarily, though that may follow, but truth. And while I am rarely stirred by such offences, this one occurred in my home against my palate and through my chef. That will not stand. No one spoke. Wolfe motioned to me. Archie. I stepped forward and began to read. The sample submitted for analysis, I said, holding up the lab report, contained a synthetic stabilizer not present in the original No. 3 recipe. This compound is commonly used in mass-produced broth to extend shelf life. It is undetectable to most palates but leaves a trace in chemical tests. Cora shifted in her seat. Lila looked at the floor. Eva, perched in her chair like a student at a science fair, smiled slightly. I continued. Additionally, our cellar inventory was tampered with. 1 jar replaced, another tainted. The means of entry? A falsified spice delivery accepted during a narrow window with opportunity afforded only to 1 visitor, Ms. Rourke. Lila's head snapped up. I didn't. Wolfe raised a finger. She stopped. I am not accusing you of the idea, he said, only of the execution. He turned to Eva. You are a talented chemist and a fool. Your replication failed not because of science, but because of arrogance. You believed taste could be simulated, but you misunderstood it. No. 3 is not merely broth. It is the culmination of instinct, memory, and precision. It cannot be reverse-engineered without conscience. Eva opened her mouth. Wolfe waved her silent again. And you, Miss Bentley, he said. You sought to erase originality, to declare that what you could not buy was therefore never real. That is a coward's logic. She flushed red, her jaw tightening. But she didn't speak. I offer you this, Wolfe said. Withdraw your patent challenge, withdraw your flavor profile claim, and I will consider this matter closed. If I don't, she asked, voice brittle. Wolfe nodded to me. I stepped forward. With a thin folder, containing every memo, tampered jar photo, spice rack image, lab report, and visitor log Wolfe had compiled. He said, Then I release all of this, publicly, to the press, to your shareholders, to the court of culinary opinion, and I assure you they are far less forgiving than I am." The room held its breath. Then Cora stood, smoothed her jacket. "I'll be in touch," she said, and walked out. Eva followed, subdued now. Lila lingered, then rose and whispered, "I'm sorry." Wolfe didn't reply. When the room emptied, Wolfe closed his eyes. "I will not forget," he murmured. "To forgive?" I asked. "No, to salt the broth properly." And that, in Wolfe's world, was the last word. The next evening arrived wearing a silence that settled over the brownstone like a velvet curtain. Not even the orchids dared to flutter. Fritz kept the house immaculate and the kitchen closed. Per Wolfe's request, no dinner was to be prepared until the final guest had left and the last lie had been pinned to the board. Wolfe wanted nothing to interrupt the dissection of truth, not even duck confit or braised turnips. That's how you knew he was serious. When Nero Wolfe delayed a meal, something or someone was about to be carved up instead. Promptly at 7 o'clock, the suspects arrived once more, this time summoned directly, without ambiguity. There was no mistaking the tone of Wolfe's. Typed notes. "You are requested to appear in my office at the above time. Refusal will be interpreted as confession." That kind of language gets attention. Cora Bentley was first through the door, again dressed in tailored frost and perfume thick, enough to melt resolve. She didn't speak. She swept in, took the same seat she had before, and crossed her legs with all the grace of a woman preparing for court. Lila Rourke followed next, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Nervous, alert, spine straight, but trembling. Then came Harold Mincer, clutching a folder that was probably supposed to look like a dossier but felt more like a shield. And finally, Brother Thomas entered quietly, nodding to me as he passed. No sign of Eva Renault yet, but I'd been told Saul was fetching her personally and not giving her the option to decline. Wolfe remained seated behind his desk, more still than usual. His hands were folded precisely on the blotter, his eyes half-lidded but watchful. He let them all settle into their chairs without a word. The silence stretched long enough to make even Cora shift slightly. Then finally Wolfe spoke. "I have summoned you because the questions surrounding the unauthorized reproduction of a proprietary broth and the attempt to nullify its originality are now resolved. I know who was involved, in what capacity, and for what purpose. What remains is only to affix the guilt to the proper names and terms." Mincer leaned forward. "You're saying the broth was stolen?" "No," Wolfe replied. "Worse, it was counterfeited. Not to make profit, but to destroy uniqueness. It is an offense of sabotage cloaked in the language of science." He turned slightly toward Cora. "Your company has made moves to patent a flavor profile you claim to have. Replicated independently, this is false. Your agents acquired a partial sample from the monastery of St. Elmira, specifically a batch marked Rosemary Trial. You then attempted to reproduce number 3 under commercial conditions, using stabilizers and masking agents." Cora raised her eyebrows. "Do you have proof of this wild theory?" Brother Thomas confirmed the breach, Wolfe said, and Ms. Renault's lab results provided the missing link. The presence of a shelf-life stabilizer incompatible with Fritz's kitchen proves artificial reconstruction. You would not know this, of course. You relied on Renault and Rourke. Lila froze. "I didn't." "You facilitated entry," Wolfe said calmly. "Whether knowingly or through negligence remains for you to clarify." He reached into the drawer and produced a photograph, taken by me at Wolfe's request. It showed the cellar shelf before and after tampering, one jar slightly misaligned, one lid fingerprinted and wiped, one label altered. Wolfe passed it across, the desk to Mincer. "You, Mr. Mincer, were not directly involved, but you were aware of the efforts to sabotage the number 3 sample after you received an anonymous submission showing 98.7% replication." Mincer sighed. "I thought it was a challenge. I didn't know where it came from. I didn't want to get pulled back into Cora's circus." Wolfe nodded. "Then your reluctance will be your salvation." The door opened. Saul entered, guiding Eva Renault by the elbow. She didn't resist. She walked into the room like it was a laboratory, eyes scanning every corner. When she saw the others, she stopped. "Is this the Inquisition?" she asked. "No," Wolfe said. "This is the reckoning." He gestured for her to sit. She didn't. She stood beside the desk, chin high. "You believe you replicated number 3, Wolfe continued. "You did not. You forged its silhouette. What you created was a mimic. Chemically similar, emotionally void. The trace stabilizer proved your deception, and the missing aftertaste, the dynamic element, eluded you." Eva didn't flinch. "Taste is chemical." "No." Wolfe said, "Taste is human. It lives in the spaces between molecules. You ignored the possibility that number 3's essence was not formulaic, but instinctual." She smirked. "And now what? You lecture us about flavor?" "No," he said, reaching for the final envelope on his desk. "I name you. You, Miss Renaud, trespassed onto monastic grounds under false identity. You stole a prototype batch. You created a false sample. You swapped jars in this very home, using a falsified spice delivery arranged by Ms. Rourke, and you submitted it anonymously to Bentley Kitchens, who used it as grounds for a patent challenge." Wolfe looked to Cora. "Withdraw it, publicly." "Or I publish this evidence." Cora said nothing. Wolfe turned to Lila. "You have the option to testify. I suggest you consider it." Lila looked down, lips tight. Then Wolfe addressed the room as a whole. "You have not merely endangered reputations. You have violated the sanctity of originality. This house, the brownstone, was breached. That alone makes it personal. You may leave now. But know this. Should any further attempt be made to dispute the provenance of number 3, I will pursue its defense not in silence, but in spectacle." He didn't wait for a response. He closed his eyes and leaned back, signaling the end of the session. One by one they rose. Eva was the last to leave, her smugness now shriveled, her chin a little lower. Mincer gave me a nod on the way out, part apology, part relief. Lila didn't meet my eyes. Brother Thomas offered Wolfe a quiet, solemn thank you before vanishing down the stairs. Only Cora lingered. She stood beside Wolfe's desk, staring at the empty bowl Fritz had left for display. The last bit of original. "Number 3. You know it wasn't about profit," she said quietly. "I know," Wolfe replied. She didn't speak again. Just turned and walked out. When the door clicked shut behind her, Wolfe finally exhaled. I leaned against the doorway. "You going to eat now?" "In a moment," he said. He opened one eye and looked at me. "You've done well, Archie." "I always do," Wolfe grunted. And in that grunt was victory, vindication, and the slow return to the equilibrium of the brownstone. But I knew better. The battle had ended. The war, for taste, for truth, for turf, was still simmering. The next morning, the brownstone was unnaturally quiet. Wolfe had slept late, as he always did after an evening of intellectual combat. I was up early, nursing coffee and going over the case notes out of habit more than necessity. It was all there now. Every layer, every move, every motive. What remained wasn't discovery, but confirmation. And Nero Wolfe was never satisfied with anything less than a complete unraveling. At 11 he rang for me. I stepped into the office to find him seated, dressed, and already sipping beer. He was contemplative, not in the dreamy, drifting way most men get when they reflect, but sharp-edged, exacting. A man doing inventory of human failure. "Archie," he said, "we will receive a visitor within the hour. Prepare the record." I raised an eyebrow. "You expecting a confession?" "No," he said. "An arrangement." He didn't have to say who. There was only one person who would return voluntarily after last night's lashing. Cora Bentley. Wolfe had publicly cornered her, but privately, he knew people like Cora didn't admit defeat. They negotiated it. Fritz appeared with Wolfe's eggs. He dismissed them with a glance. "She won't sign anything," I guessed. "No," Wolfe agreed. "But she will concede in the only language she understands, control." At 12:07 the doorbell rang. Horowitz opened it, and Cora stepped in like she owned the block. No entourage this time, no fur or perfume armor. She wore a plain coat and gloves, and carried nothing but a folded paper tucked under one arm. Wolfe didn't rise. She didn't expect him to. She walked into the office and looked around, then directly at him. "You win," she said. Wolfe tapped the corner of a blotter. "That is too vague." She unfolded the paper. It was a withdrawal of patent filing, signed and notarized. Wolfe scanned it, gave a curt nod and passed it to me. "I trust you'll keep your version of events quiet," she said. "Not unless prompted," Wolfe replied. "Do not prompt me." She hesitated. "Do you know why I tried? To destroy it?" Wolfe arched a brow. "Because I tasted it once," she said, "and I couldn't explain it. Not the ingredients, not the reaction, it made me angry. That is your failing, not Fritz's." She stepped back. "I know. Goodbye, Mr. Wolfe." When the door closed, Wolfe stared at it a moment longer than usual. Then he turned to me. "It is done." "Not yet," I said. "We haven't heard from Eva." Wolfe shook his head. "She is irrelevant now. Without Cora's umbrella, she vanishes." And that was true. Without the corporate engine behind her, Eva's replica broth was a curiosity at best, a bootleg at worst. No investor, no court, no chef would touch it now. Still, I had one more question. Why her? Why did Cora pick Eva and not someone more discreet? Wolfe gave me a look. Because she misunderstood genius. She thought eccentricity equaled brilliance. But Eva's flaw was not in her science. It was in her certainty, meaning she believed chemistry was destiny. That replication proved ownership. She did not consider that taste is personal. It is built from memory, context, emotion. You cannot patent nostalgia. He rose, slowly, the way he always did when a matter had finally been laid to. "Rest, you had this figured out before the spice rack," I said. "Of course," he replied. "The moment Fritz said the broth tasted almost right. Why didn't you act then?" "Because I required the attempt to escalate. I needed their hand exposed. Nothing less would bring Cora to her knees." "Cold?" I said. "Accurate," he corrected. He went into the kitchen and I followed. Fritz had already laid out lunch now that the danger had passed. He served number 3 himself, ladled with reverence. Wolfe took 1 spoonful, then 2, then leaned back and closed his eyes. "Perfect," he whispered. "You ever going to write this one up?" I asked. "No, but you will." "Under what title?" He opened one eye. "The broth that broke the alibi." I smiled. "Too dramatic." He shook his head. "Precisely dramatic enough." We ate in silence after that. No tension, no lingering. Questions. Outside, the world went on. Patents filed, recipes written, reputations massaged. But inside the brownstone, one truth had held: some things cannot be reproduced. Some things, like the taste of Fritz's broth, live only once. And that, more than evidence or alibi, was what made them valuable. So when I filed the paperwork, I didn't just file the lab results or the tampering photos. I added something, else a single line scribbled in my notes. Originality isn't just rare, it's sacred. Wolfe would never admit it aloud. But he knew it too. And this time he defended it like a king defends his throne, with silence, with logic, and with the perfect spoonful of vengeance. The case officially ended the way all Nero Wolfe cases end, quietly, without applause, and with the precise rearrangement of routine, as if nothing had happened. But if you knew Wolfe the way I do, you could sense the difference. It wasn't in his tone or his posture or his appetite, which returned with a vengeance. It was in the timing of his sighs, the way he adjusted the position of his chair, the way his silence was slightly softer around the edges. That's Wolfe's version of relief. A case that threatened the sanctity of his taste and his territory had been resolved not through courts or shouting, but through calm obliteration, his preferred method. Fritz resumed his kitchen routine as if the past week had been a footnote, not a near-holy war over a broth. That morning, he sent up a plate of eggs with extra herbs, and Wolfe accepted it, without comment. That was as close as Fritz would get to a handshake. In this house, forgiveness wasn't granted with words. It was restored through equilibrium. I sat in my usual chair across from Wolfe, tapping out a final summary for our files. He didn't look at me, but he knew what I was doing. He always did. "You've omitted something," he said after 10 minutes. I didn't look up. "You'll have to be more specific. I've omitted plenty." "Eva's motive," he said. You left it under professional sabotage. Incomplete. Wasn't that it? No. He folded his hands. Eva didn't want to discredit the broth. She wanted to unmask it. I frowned. Same thing, isn't it? Not quite, Wolfe said. To discredit is to destroy belief. To unmask is to destroy mystique. Eva believed number 3 was a myth inflated by taste bias. She resented that mystique. She wanted to prove that genius could be dismantled and rebuilt, and Cora gave her the tools. Yes, but not the insight. Wolfe leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Eva was intelligent, but she lacked humility, and humility is required when attempting to imitate that which was never purely rational. Fritz won then. Wolfe raised a brow. He was never in danger. It was I who was tested. And there it was. That was what this had really been about from Wolfe's perspective. Not a jar of soup, not a missing label, not a petty rivalry between corporations. It had been a challenge to his judgment, to his palate, to his power over his world. The brownstone wasn't just his home, it was a fortress of order, and someone had tried to rearrange the bricks. I watched him for a moment, then asked, "You think Cora will try again?" "She won't need to," he replied. "She has tasted humility, it won't agree with her." We both chuckled. Then the phone rang. Wolfe gestured for me to take it, so I did. Brownstone. The voice on the other end was clipped, formal, and unmistakably corporate. "This is Victor Hammond from the Culinary Standards Board. We've received a voluntary retraction of a flavor profile filing from Bentley Kitchens, with an attached letter referencing your name and legal position." I glanced at Wolfe. "Go on." The letter was concise. It stated, "The claim submitted was built on misrepresentation, and Mr. Nero Wolfe has provided compelling reason to reconsider." Wolfe reached for his beer. "Mr. Goodwin," the caller continued, "we'd like to offer Mr. Wolfe a position as an honorary standards consultant." I covered the mouthpiece. He gave me a look that said, "If you repeat that offer aloud, you'll be banished." So I politely declined. Wolfe didn't work for boards. He ran his own court of reason, with no appeals. When I hung up, Wolfe was already moving on, his eyes scanning a new book, some thick volume on Ottoman spice trade routes. Because naturally, after nearly being framed over a jar of broth, he wanted to read about 16th century turmeric trafficking. I stretched out, placed the closed case file back in the drawer, and leaned back. "You know," I said, "most people would have just sued." He didn't look up. "Most people are inadequate. You want to do something normal this week? Watch a movie, take a walk." He cut me off with a dismissive grunt. "Dinner, then?" "That," he said, "is acceptable." So we ate. Fritz prepared number 3 again, this time served with a small glass of sherry and a dish of braised leeks. Wolfe savored every bite, then asked for a second helping. I took that as a sign the world had realigned. That night, as I was turning out the lights in the office, I found one last note Wolfe had written in the margin of his report. It wasn't for the files. It wasn't to be read aloud. It was just, fail scribbled line, underlined twice. "Genius must be guarded, not from thieves, but from those who insist it can be manufactured." I smiled. That was Nero Wolfe, exact, proud, and infuriatingly correct. And with that, the door to the broth that broke the alibi finally closed. Justice, as always, had been served. Hot, precise, and impossible to replicate. 3 days after the case had ended, life at the brownstone settled back into what Wolfe called its natural equilibrium, which in plain English meant he stopped glowering at the kitchen door and resumed regular hours in the plant rooms. The orchids survived the storm. Of intellectual warfare, Fritz regained full confidence in his ladle, and I had time to organize the chaos into a readable report. But as I went over every note, every motive, every ingredient, something about this case stuck to my ribs in a way most didn't. This one hadn't revolved around a corpse or blackmail or diamonds tucked in hatbands. No blood, no bullets, and yet Wolfe had treated it like a moral war. Because it wasn't just an attack on taste, it was an attack on the intangible. And Wolfe, though he'd never admit it, was a guardian of the intangible. Late that Friday afternoon, Wolfe called me into the office. Not for a briefing, not for another round of dictation, just to talk. "You've completed the documentation?" he asked without looking up. "Every last syllable. Indexed, dated, annotated. You can sleep easy." "I sleep easily, regardless." I smiled. "Of course, you dream of sources and Latin etymologies." He didn't reply, just sat there for a while, fingers steepled, eyes half shut, as if listening for something most men couldn't hear. Then he said, "Archie, what is genius?" I blinked. "Is this a test?" "No." "All right." I leaned against the desk. "Genius is something you can't explain but can't deny either. It works when it shouldn't. It wins without trying. It makes other people suspicious." Wolfe gave the faintest nod. "Acceptable." "Is this about number 3? "It's about everything," he replied. "We live in an age of measurement, and in measurement the immeasurable is seen as either fraudulent or unnecessary." "You mean people want proof of things that don't need to be proved?" "No. Worse. They want to possess the unprovable. And failing that, they attempt to disprove it." He reached for his beer, sipped, and set it down with the slow precision of a man practicing control. That is what Cora Bentley attempted. She encountered a creation she could neither replicate nor purchase, and so she set out to destroy its legitimacy, not through malice, but through belief. Belief in what? That anything unowned must be invalid. I let that sit for a moment. She didn't hate number 3. No, she hated that she didn't own it. Genius, when it lives outside capital, becomes a threat. He turned toward the window. Fritz's broth was never about ingredients. It was about timing, intuition, restraint. You cannot quantify the moment when a chef chooses to reduce rather than add. That cannot be printed, patented, or put into a spreadsheet. And so to Cora and Eva it had to be myth. And they set out to prove it, I said. "By mimicking it," he nodded. "Mimicry is not theft, it is erasure." That one landed. Wolfe didn't traffic in rhetoric, but when he chose his words, they stuck. "They didn't steal the broth," I said slowly. "They tried to erase its value by making it common." "Precisely," he didn't say more, so I didn't push it. We sat in silence, 2 men surrounded by quiet furniture and the scent of herbs drifting from the kitchen. Eventually, Wolfe said, "The true danger is not theft of property, but theft of distinction." "You think that's happening more often?" "I think," he said, "we are entering an age where distinction is seen as arrogance, where individuality must be flattened, where the unique must prove itself again and again simply to exist." I scribbled that one down. If nothing else, it was good copy. Then I asked him what I'd been wondering since it all began. "Did you ever doubt number 3? He paused. That meant yes. "I doubted," he admitted. "Not the taste, but the memory. I asked myself if my palate was remembering rather than perceiving. That is a dangerous path. You don't like dangerous paths. I prefer clear roads. But sometimes doubt is the toll for excellence." He leaned back, tired now. "I do not fear theft, Archie, but I despise manipulation. This case was not about culinary integrity. It was about power, about undermining faith, about making the original seem ordinary so that the ordinary could be passed off as original." That, more than anything, explained Wolfe's reaction. The sabotage hadn't been culinary. It had been philosophical, and Wolfe was a philosopher of order. I stood. "You want me to file that under moral injuries?" He gave me a rare smirk. "File it under human error. That's the only category large enough." We didn't talk more that day. I left him in the office, staring out the window, sipping beer like it was holy water. That night, Fritz made a new broth, number 4, though he didn't call it that. It was different. Lighter, herbal, not better, not worse. Just next. Wolfe sipped it slowly, thoughtfully, then set the spoon down. Acceptable. That was his way of saying it begins again. After dinner, I returned to the office to close the final file. I tucked the photos away, sealed the reports, and placed a fresh tag on the spine. The broth that broke the alibi. A Nero Wolfe story. I looked around the room, everything in its place. The desk, the chair, the half-drunk bottle of beer, the faint rustle of the orchids above, and I realized something. This case hadn't just been about broth or sabotage or misplaced loyalty. It had been about the last stand of something unrepeatable. In a world rushing to standardize, Wolfe had drawn a line around one small thing and said, "This will remain sacred," and he meant it. So I turned off the lamp, locked the drawer and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind a quiet office and a victory no one outside would ever understand. But Wolfe would. And so would I. The next few weeks passed without incident. The brownstone, as it often does after a storm, found its equilibrium once again. Fritz resumed his culinary experiments, though the shadows of the last case still lingered. I'd occasionally catch him staring into the stockpots or carefully measuring ingredients, his movements a little more deliberate than usual, as if he were checking for a fault that wasn't there. Wolfe, for his part, seemed unaffected. He spent his days immersed in books on ancient civilizations and obscure theories about vegetable hybrids. His food came on time, and his beer was always chilled to the exact right temperature. Life, for him, always returned to its carefully plotted rhythm. But I knew better. No one who'd faced Cora Bentley and Eva Reno could forget them so easily. No one who'd seen Nero Wolfe battle through layers of deception with nothing more than his mind could ignore the silence that followed such victories. In fact, if there was one thing Wolfe hated more than being thwarted, it was the quiet that came after a case had ended. And while it didn't show on his face, I knew something had shifted inside him. It wasn't the case that gnawed at him. It was the quiet truth that had made it a personal war. It wasn't about Broth anymore. It was about power, about control over something intangible that could never be replicated, quantified, or taken. That, I realized, was what he fought for, and that's what made him win. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what came next. For someone like Wolfe, who lived for puzzles, there had to be a new challenge waiting on the horizon. He'd destroyed an entire scheme with nothing more than a spoonful of broth and a cold stare, but it seemed like there had to be more to his method than that. I had the answer before the knock on the door came. It was 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, when Saul Panzer appeared at the threshold, looking as disheveled as ever, but with a familiar gleam in his eye. He didn't need to say anything for me to know he was here with news. Saul was never one for small talk. "Wolfe?" he asked, stepping inside and heading straight for the office. "Wolfe's waiting," I said, not even needing to look at him, to know where he was heading. Saul didn't respond, and I didn't need him to. I followed him down the hallway to the office, where Wolfe sat as usual in his chair, eyes fixed on a book and the usual cloud of quiet filling the room. He didn't look up as Saul entered, but simply raised an eyebrow. "Something's wrong," I muttered, watching Saul with keen interest. Saul gave me a quick glance. "Wrong is one word for it," he said, his voice low and strained. "The word I'm using right now is complicated." Wolfe raised his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Complicated how?" "The usual way," Saul said. "Someone's gone and messed with the wrong people." The room went still. Wolfe never liked complications. They were fine in the context of a puzzle, but in life, he preferred his riddles to come with clear, defined parameters. Saul continued. "I need your help, Wolfe. I know you're retired from these types of things, but this one's too big for me." Wolfe set the book down and for a long moment said nothing. I could see his mind clicking, the way his eyes went distant as though he was already building a framework around the problem. That was how Wolfe operated. He didn't waste time asking questions when he already knew the answer. Finally, he looked up at Saul. "Who is it?" Saul swallowed hard. "Bentley Kitchens." I froze. "Cora?" Saul nodded. "Not her, not directly, but her people." Wolfe's expression never changed, but his eyes were sharper than I'd seen in days. "Go on." "Someone from Bentley's team has been buying up land," Saul said. "The land next to St. Elmira's monastery. The monks don't know why, and neither does anyone else, but we think it's more than just corporate expansion." "Land?" I asked, confused. "What's so special about that?" "The monks don't sell their land," Saul replied. "They never have. It's been passed down for centuries, but now there's a buyer with a very deep pocketbook, someone with connections to Bentley's financial team." Wolfe didn't react immediately. Instead, he stared at Saul for a long moment. "What does this have to do with us?" "It's not the land, Wolfe," Saul said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's the recipe. I felt the room shift. Even Wolfe was silent now. 100 thoughts must have collided in his head, each one fitting into place as the threads of the mystery began to pull themselves taut. Saul cleared his throat. Someone's trying to buy their way into number 3's legacy. Cora's team wants to get to the source. If they can control the monastery, they can control the recipe. That hit me like a slap. No one had made a serious move against the recipe itself. They'd all tried before. Cora had, Eva had. But this was different. If Bentley's people were looking to buy the monastery, it meant they weren't just looking for access to the recipe. They were looking to destroy its sanctity, to remove its purity entirely. You know what they're after, I said, already, feeling the weight of it all settling around me. They're going to steal the monastery's ownership, lock it away and declare it theirs. No more open access, no more history, just a corporate-owned broth. Wolfe stared at me, his face still impassive, but his mind was already operating at full speed. Saul continued, I've got some inside sources in their finance department, but they've been keeping everything under wraps. No one knows exactly why they're acquiring the land, but the monks are scared. They've never had anyone move so quickly. If we don't act fast, they'll be part of Bentley's corporate machine before we can stop them. Wolfe finally leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You want us to intervene? Not just that, Saul said. I need you to expose them, show the world what they're doing. If we can get ahead of this, we can protect the monastery and the recipe from further manipulation. Wolfe didn't answer right away. He sat there, staring into space, weighing it all. Then, after a long pause, he said one word, done. And, just like that, the case was back on. We moved quickly after that. Saul provided the financial documents and I pored over them, identifying names, connections, and suspicious transactions. We couldn't afford to wait. Cora Bentley and her people weren't just moving fast. They were trying to erase the past and replace it with something that could be controlled. By the end of the week, we had a plan. Wolfe didn't waste time. With theatrics this time. He wanted results. We would leverage public opinion, uncover Bentley's true intentions, and expose the corporate machine's greed before it could bury history beneath a pile of paperwork. The day we presented everything, to the press, Wolfe was as calm as ever, sitting in his chair and reading his book while the storm outside the brownstone raged on. The press swarmed the area, cameras flashing, headlines already forming in the minds of those who hadn't even seen the facts. And Cora Bentley. Well, she'd underestimated Wolfe once more. By the time the dust settled, Bentley Kitchens was no longer the silent, omnipotent threat it had once been. The monastery was safe. Number 3's legacy remained untarnished, and Wolfe had once again come out victorious, not because of his strength, but because of his intellect. As we sat in the brownstone, finally quiet again, I couldn't help but ask, You think she'll try again? Wolfe's eyes flickered for a moment, but he didn't answer. He didn't need to. The battle had been fought, and the lesson had been taught. Some things can't be bought, some things are too valuable to be replicated. The dust had settled, though not as neatly as some would have liked. Cora Bentley's empire had taken a serious blow, but like any seasoned businesswoman, she wasn't out for good. Wolfe had his victory, but he also knew there would be no trophy at the end of this case, no final applause. The work, as always, was about restoration, about correcting the balance that had been disturbed. I leaned back in my chair, watching as Wolfe finished the last of his beer. He had his usual post-case look, eyes half-lidded, mind working in directions only he could predict. The events of the last few weeks had unfolded precisely as he expected, but that didn't mean it wasn't exhausting for him. Archie, he said, his voice low and thoughtful, did I ever tell you why I don't tolerate mimicry? I raised an eyebrow, but I already knew the answer. It wasn't about the challenge of someone duplicating his methods. Wolfe hated mimicry because it stripped the value of originality. The very idea that someone could claim what was never truly theirs, whether a broth recipe or a thought, was anathema to him. He thrived on the authenticity of what was his, and number 3, in all its glory, was just another example of that. No, I don't believe you have, I replied. He gave me a glance, an almost imperceptible smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Because true value exists in rarity, in uniqueness. If it could be copied, it wouldn't be worth anything, I thought for a moment. You're talking about more than just soup, aren't you? Wolfe nodded once. Yes. I've spent a lifetime observing people attempt to replicate that which they cannot understand. They do not value what they cannot control. And you? I have always valued what cannot be controlled, he replied. The last few days had been a whirlwind of media appearances, public statements, and legal wrangling. Bentley Kitchens had backed down from its claim. The media buzz had died down, leaving behind a quiet triumph for Wolfe and a slightly more secure future for Fritz's beloved number 3. It was an odd kind of justice, the kind that didn't require dramatic confrontations or harsh penalties. It was a quieter kind of victory, one that restored the world to its rightful order. That evening, as the rain began to tap gently against the windows, Wolfe looked out into the gloom of the city below. There was something final about his posture, something that signaled the end of this chapter. "We've done enough for today, Archie," he said. I nodded, rising from my seat. It wasn't often that Wolfe admitted to having done enough. It was strange for him to leave a case truly behind, without the prospect of another challenge lingering on the horizon. But tonight, he seemed content. The storm had passed, and things were in their place once again. I walked to the door, pausing before leaving. Wolfe didn't look at me, but I could sense the weight of his thoughts. "Do you think they'll try again?" I asked, my hand on the doorframe. Wolfe paused. His gaze shifted from the window to the empty room. There was no arrogance in his response, no victory-laden remark. "Not in the same way. The game has changed. But some battles, Archie, are not about winning. They're about ensuring the next one isn't even worth fighting." I turned the handle, the door creaking open with its familiar sound. As I stepped out, the quiet that filled the brownstone seemed like the perfect punctuation to a story that had already ended, one that would never need to be retold. The case was closed, and the world would move on, unperturbed, in its own rhythm. Smiled, knowing the lesson had been learned. It wasn't about pretending to own something that couldn't be owned. It was about respecting what could never be replicated, and in that, Wolfe had once again proven that intellect, not force, was the final arbiter of truth. And so, as always, the brownstone remained, untouched, unbothered, and as unyielding as ever.